when you talk about the influence on policymaking of certain popular trends or trends in thinking, it's very difficult, I think, to trace any concrete, in any concrete way, the transmission and absorption of ideas and modes of thought up to the level of the country's policymakers. I've studied and written quite a lot about the influence of pro-Israeli thinking and of the Israel lobby and its activities on U.S. policymaking on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. That's my thing. And I think that you have to conclude that there is a profound influence on policymaking, but that it is very hard to pinpoint precisely and very hard actually to link public thinking directly about Israel directly to this effect on policymaking. It's obviously equally difficult to trace popular thinking about Islam and Muslims to actual policy decisions, but I think it's absolutely clear that the current anti-Muslim atmosphere and culture in this country is having a profound impact on policy formulation. Just to give an example of what I mean, also like Richard Silverstein, you can tell that I'm not speaking just from notes. I don't do that very well, but so I'm basically reading at least part of what I'm talking about here. Just to give an example of what I mean about the difficulty of drawing a straight line from popular thinking to policy making. Several years ago, as probably many of you know, two scholars, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, this was 5 years ago, wrote a groundbreaking article on the influence of the Israel lobby on policymaking, which was, and obviously remains, a very controversial topic. Many Israeli supporters don't like to hear that U.S. policy support for Israel might involve something like crass politics or anything other than true affection for Israel. And many fear that any talk of Jewish influence on policy will lead to increased anti-Semitism. So this article on the lobby, which appeared 5 years ago in the London Review of Books, and which was later expanded in 2007 to a book entitled The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, this provoked a great deal of criticism. And one criticism that sticks out in my mind when the article first came out 5 years ago was a statement by David Gergen, a Republican political commentator and consultant who has served as a presidential advisor in both Republican and Democratic administrations. He worked in the Clinton administration as well as Republican administrations. And he declared positively that in all his years of serving in the White House, he had never seen a decision made as a result from pressure from the Israel lobby. Thank you very much. This is obviously absurd. Policy decisions rarely come out, they're rarely that direct. They rarely come out of a meeting between a White House official, policy decisions on anything, and on this subject rarely come out of a meeting between a White House official and an official, for instance, of the Israel lobby. Where the influence comes in is in the discourse that lobby action creates or that anti-Muslim propaganda creates. This is what Richard Silverstein was talking about. This is a public mindset that becomes so entrenched that it's almost never challenged. That says, in the case of the Palestinians and Israel, that virtually everything Israel does is good, that Palestinians are basically terrorists, and that they have no inherent rights in Palestine. And with Islam and the Muslims, the public, popular discourse in this country is, as we all know, that's what we're here talking about, increasingly anti-Islamic and Islamophobic. The important thing to keep in mind when we talk about a discourse is that it is a general, pervasive state of mind, a way of thinking that gradually but inevitably becomes second nature, that it's automatic and unquestioning, and people, I think, in many cases don't even realize that they think this way. And this is largely because it is constantly fed and encouraged by, in one instance, the pro-Israel lobbyists, and in the case that we're all here talking about this weekend, today, is in the case of Islamophobes. The noted theologian Miroslav Volf, who grew up in Croatia in the former Yugoslavia and now teaches at Yale, has just come out with a book entitled entitled Allah. Steve is reading the book. He's farther along than I am. It talks about precisely this state of mind and discourse about Islam in this book, which came out just this year. And this is what he says at one point. Sometimes, he says, when I observe contemporary U.S. culture with its hard fronts and nasty culture wars, I have a strange sense that I've seen something like this before in the communist and semi-totalitarian state in which I grew up. This is Wolf talking. The issues and positions are very different, but the spirit is strangely familiar. In all public discussion, there was a party line that people had to toe. If you diverged, you were deemed disloyal and suspected of betraying the cause. I sense a spirit today among both progressives and conservatives in the United States when it comes to many hot-button issues, including Islam. Progressives and conservatives differ radically in their perspectives, but each group has a set of politically correct views about Muslims and Islam, unquote. And I would say that on that subject, also on the subject of Israel, progressives and conservatives have pretty much the same politically correct set of views. So this is the kind of atmosphere in which politicians and policymakers grow up and cut their political teeth, whether we're talking about attitudes toward Israel or toward Islam. Policymakers have no more opportunity than the rest of us to learn any other perspective. They gain access to so-called inside information when they enter government, possibly gain this access, but it doesn't really have much of an impact on views formed and more or less set in concrete in earlier years when they are just ordinary citizens like the rest of us and don't have access to, are not given access to, for instance, an open-minded view of Israel or of Islam by the media, just as an example. William Pfaff, who is a very astute, living now in Paris, American commentator who's been writing on U.S. foreign policy for decades, recently wrote a column pointing out that there is what he called a pervasive ignorance in U.S. policymaking circles and in Congress these days about substantive Middle East issues, having to do with both Islam and Iraq and Afghanistan and Israel and so on. And also about other regions of the world, but he was talking specifically about the Middle East. Pfaff commented that foreign policy is no longer, as he quotes, as he says, developed and conducted by people who actually are seriously acquainted with foreign matters and foreign countries and are aware of the history of the areas in which America is trying to function. In other words, policymakers are pretty ignorant these days, he says, and I agree with him, which is quite an indictment. Pfaff also quotes another commentator's even stronger indictment. This is from a well-known Palestinian commentator in Beirut who lives and writes in Beirut, Rami Khouri, who has written that the U.S. has become, and this is a quote, a marginal player in much of the Middle East, largely as a consequence of its own incompetence, inconsistency, bias, and weakness in allowing its Middle East policy to be shaped by neoconservative fanatics, pro-Israeli zealots, anti-Islamic demagogues, Christian fundamentalist extremists, and assorted other strange folks, unquote. This is particularly interesting because Khouri can be very direct, as here, but he's usually not quite this outspoken, but I think he's hit the nail on the head. The thing to keep in mind here, as I've been saying, is that this whole issue, this whole hysteria about Islam has become so much a political issue that even if policymakers did have an opportunity to gain a different and more open-minded perspective, they would most likely not have the political courage to stand up to or counter what has increasingly become a mainstream perspective. I think the inclination of most politicians is to accommodate mass grassroots movements. It's a matter of campaign finance funds. Richard Silverstein was talking about the incident of trying to get Mark Potok to speak at this conference. And the Southern Poverty Law, whatever conference, whatever the C stands for, fear of losing its money from its donors. This is the same thing that happens with politicians. They're all afraid of opposing Israel, criticizing Israel openly for fear of losing campaign funds. And I think many of them are afraid of losing the same campaign contributions if they dare to defend Islam or defend Muslims. This has, I think, been true of President Obama. I would say he's been unable to stand up to just about anybody on the US political scene on any subject who's opposed him. Some of you may disagree with me, but I don't think any of us would say that he has stood up very well to the Islamophobia in this country. And again, William Pfaff has a comment on Obama's behavior. Barack Obama, he says, quote, "The Chicago community organizer, innocent of experience in international affairs, who took office with advisors who convinced him that Afghanistan was the right war, quote unquote, and that Pakistan, with its nuclear weapons, had to be brought under decisive American influence, now has turned wary of further engagements." This was written in the middle of or sort of at the beginning of the Libya intervention. He fears, to quote, to continue with the Pfaff, quote, Obama fears still another American ground engagement in the Islamic world, but is afraid to condemn the ones that the United States is already committed to, because he fears electoral attack as surrendering to terrorism, betraying our soldiers, inviting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to install Sharia law in American courtrooms, and humbling America before the new caliphs. These fears, Pfaff declares, are all utter nonsense. Now, I think the assassination of Osama bin Laden may relieve Obama of some of the criticism, but it won't relieve the pressure on him to prove himself, particularly since he's still being accused of being a Muslim, as if that were an accusation. To prove himself, he's under pressure to prove himself a true opponent of militant Islam, and it won't make him, I don't think, a more honest policymaker or a justice and peace president. Now, this is where I get to my notes, where I may be a little more scattered. I don't want to go into the history of Islamophobia. I think we know enough about that since we're all here and we've been listening last night and today. But as it relates to policymaking, we could go back to the Crusades, but there are sort of landmarks along the road, along the way in the last 10 to 15 years. Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations, which had a huge impact, I think, on shaping people's thinking about how supposedly awful Islam is. Bernard Lewis is another scholar who actually, I think the term Clash of Civilizations was initially his, and Huntington picked it up and ran with it and wrote a book on it. Both of these, particularly Bernard Lewis, are sort of the intellectual gurus of the neocon movement, which was and still is, to a little bit lesser extent, but a hugely important political force in this country. This is a lobby and a group of propagandists who ended up as policymakers in the Bush administration. So they're another interesting phenomenon about this, to back up a little bit, is that everything is so interlinked here, and it is sort of a vicious circle. This is the fact that neocons were in the Bush administration, generating wars against Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, made them the initiators of Islamophobia, but then active participants in the creation of a discourse. But then a lot of it comes from grassroots movements such as the Pam Geller and people like well, Pam Geller, I can't think of, Frank Gaffney, and a few other think tank people whom Richard Silverstein was talking about. So it is, the Islamophobia comes down in many instances from policymakers, and it works its way up to influence policymakers. And all of the major groups who are involved in promoting Islamophobia are interlinked in many cases in all of them. I mean, they are the same people in one group and another. There are Christian fundamentalists, Christian Zionists, Tea Partiers, Israeli supporters, and a lot of this Islamophobia, impetus for Islamophobia comes from Israel, but it also comes without benefit of influence from Israel, comes from Israeli supporters, such as the people, many of the people Richard was talking about a few minutes ago. The European right wing is increasingly Islamophobic, and that has an influence on the US. Fortunately, not yet quite as, it's not as strong in this country as it is in Europe. And so all of these people work together. You know, many of the Tea Partiers, in fact, maybe most of them, are Christian fundamentalists and Christian Zionists, and so on. And so as I said, they work together, and in many instances, they are the same people in the different groups. The ideas of this Islamophobia become rooted in the discourse through these people's, the propaganda of these groups, through the media, through books. There are a lot of books that are very Islamophobic these days, put out by mainstream publishers. And you know, it's, as I said, it's hard to trace a direct line, but I think we can all understand the elements of Islamophobia that show up as policy. I think Islamophobia has something to do with the fact that we're fighting a war in Iraq, also that we're fighting a war in Afghanistan and in Libya. I mean, all the places where we are fighting wars seem to be Islamic countries. I would say, and some people may disagree with me, that some of our war making is because of our support for Israel and our effort to advance Israeli regional hegemony. That's a controversial subject. I'd be happy to take questions, and I am going to turn this over to discussion in just a second. I think I'm almost done. Two things that I took notes on this morning. Jeff Siddiqui said, all we have to do is force our leaders to lead. Now that's a perfect statement of what we need to do. It's not quite as easy as he made it sound, or as it may sound, but it's what we need to do to make them aware of what we're talking about here today in this conference, of the dangers of Islamophobia and how and what it's leading our policymakers to do around the world. And Ivan Haddad said that Muslims, the result of this policy is that Muslims overseas understand, they believe, and I think they're right, that the US is on a crusade to eliminate Islam because of the campaign to eliminate Sharia. Now, I don't necessarily think that Barack Obama is consciously on a campaign to eliminate Islam, but he is an agent of doing that sort of thing, I think. So, so on that sort of feeble note, I'm going to close and turn this over to questions. We have about 20 minutes, so yes, sir. That is the question of the century. I don't know. I don't have a good formula. Jeff's talked about force our leaders to lead. Get a letter writing campaign together to write to Maria Cantwell. I come from New Mexico. I'm probably the only one here from New Mexico, and it's hard to get, I mean, the whole population of New Mexico is probably about the population of the Seattle area. I think it's very difficult. What I'm telling you is, I mean, the way I'm answering you is to sort of express defeat. I think there is more, at least on the Israel-Palestine issue, there is more of a grassroots movement now, more awareness in organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and bloggers like Richard Silverstein and so on. At the workshop that I was at in this hall this morning, Ted Falcon and Jamal Rahman were talking God, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, I forgot what it was I was going to say they had said. But there is more movement, but and I don't know how to make this happen, but it hasn't gotten up to the political level. And the only thing I can think of is we need more numbers. I mean, this is a wonderful turnout. If there could be more things like this. I just don't know how to influence policymakers. I've been trying to do that since I ceased working for the government myself and haven't made any success. Hold on a second. Over here. Yeah. Well, that would be good. If I don't know how to accomplish that. I mean, the country has been moving farther and farther to the right, partly because of the neocons, as you said. You know, in sort of radical, wild movements like this, in the past there was always a correction, and there is no correction anymore because we are moving to the center. Jeff, I don't know of anybody suing. The New York Times did write an article on this fairly recently, surprisingly enough, exposing it. I don't think there was any hint that, you know, that anybody is or should be suing. And I don't know, you know, the U.S. Treasury is the one that allows this to happen, is the organization that allows this to happen. So I'm not enough of a legal expert to know whether such a suit is even possible, and nobody is having the, you know, the gumption to initiate it just yet anyways. Yeah, yeah.
It's legal it's deductible to send money to Israel.
It is, I know, exactly, so. Even though, as this gentleman says, it's against international law to support.
I can't hear what his question is.
Oh, he said it is legal and it is deductible to make contributions to some of these these organizations that support Israeli settlements. Or Israel directly, yeah. I mean, Israel bonds and so on. So, I don't know how you combat that. Yes, ma'am. But she's talking about the bus ads that came up several months ago declaring what Israel does, a war crime, has done in Gaza and so on. And the bus company, huh? Well, that's the second step, right? I mean, it went from bus ads, which were pulled down by the bus company, and my understanding is that billboards have been up and taken down. We went through this in Albuquerque also. Yeah. Yes, I know. They have some billboards up now, smaller ones, but finally got a company that will leave them up. But look at that as a problem. I mean, here's a big metropolitan area which can get out an audience like this. Basically, all of us are in the same choir, and still cannot get you know, public officials to support a statement that says that is actually, by international law, true. Yeah, exactly. This gentleman over here. That would be the ideal. The trouble is the U.S. still, although its influence is waning, is the king of the world, is the ruler of the world. The United States vetoes when the United Nations Security Council tries to put out a simple resolution declaring that the settlements Israeli settlements are against international law. The United States vetoes it, even though United States policy, and Susan Rice in the UN and Barack Obama all say these settlements should be stopped. Yet we vetoed it because we are afraid of pressure from the pro-Israel lobby, I think, and because this is our position. Nobody in the rest of the world, NATO, European governments, who are becoming increasingly right-wing, for one thing, will counter us. I mean, it used to be, you know, we called Tony Blair the Bush's poodle. Well, now David Cameron is Obama's poodle, and Cameron is he's more right-wing than Tony Blair is on this issue, and probably on all other issues too. But it just seems impossible to get the world together to do that. Even the Arab League, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, at least under Mubarak, would not counter U.S. policy. You know, we give them in cash aid, in a grant aid, not even a loan, $3 billion of military aid every year. And we therefore enable all of the international law violations that Israel is committing. And how we, that is, we at this level, get we at the political level to stop doing that is a big mystery to me. And because the United States does it, Europe is going to follow us, and NATO's following us, and the Arab states who depend on us for their aid or their oil purchases would just go along with us. It's a huge, momentous problem. Yes, sir, back here. That's an I presume everybody heard this, to comment on the Palestinian plan to get the UN General Assembly to recognize a Palestinian state, which is going to come up in September. I'm glad to see that the Palestinian Authority is finally showing some gumption and doing this because, despite the fact that the U.S. is urging them not to do it, and despite the fact that it's making Benjamin Netanyahu angry. I don't actually think it's going to do any good, because the thinking is that if Palestine, a Palestinian state is a member of the UN, that Israel would then come under pressure for illegally occupying a fellow country or illegally attacking, or, you know, if they bomb Gaza or something like that. The problem is Israel has been attacking Lebanon in 2006, Lebanon in 1982. Who else? Anyway, those are two prime examples, and nobody ever said a word. Nobody ever complained. So I don't really think that the international community, unfortunately, is going to rally to the defense of Palestine if Israel again invades Jenin or Nablus or something. So I don't think it's a bad move, but I'm not sure it's going to be quite, I don't think the Israelis, who are quite worried, or say they're quite worried about it, need worry so much, and I don't think that those who are thinking this is a great move that their optimism is going to pan out quite. So let me, this gentleman back here. That's the only way it's going to happen. I'm not sure that 1 million is enough. You know, before the Iraq War, I think there were 1 million people out on the streets protesting that war before it started, and it didn't do us any good. But that's the only way it can start, is to get the first 18, the first 1,000, the first 1 million, and then build it. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's how we got out of Vietnam, because people got out in the streets in the millions, plural, and forced policymakers to get out. A little too late, but anyway, so we just have to keep this idea in our mind. Yes, I'm glad you said that. I think that's an excellent point. I think the problem is, certainly a problem is, Israel has peace right now. There's very little terrorism. There has been very little terrorism for several years. What we need to fight for is justice, not peace. Peace without justice is an empty concept. It should be. It should be justice action, not peace action, because what you've just. Yes. Well, we can fight for justice. We can fight for justice more easily than we can fight for peace. You just defined the problem. Because you don't know how to make peace in Israel-Palestine, you ignore it. You and, I don't mean just you and every, the Committee for Peace and Justice, I forget this Iraq War era organization that has basically ceased to exist. Because all of these organizations ignore the hard problems, because you're only looking for peace. If you tried to fight for justice, there are specific ways to get justice for the Palestinians, which would mean peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. Justice for the Palestinians is giving them some equal treatment, is getting the Israelis out of their country, out of at least the occupied territories, getting some equality of citizenship for Palestinians who have been under Israeli domination for 63 years. Most of them without any equality at all, and the ones who are Israeli citizens without enough equality. So I think you can fight for just peace. Is a nebulous concept. It's a wonderful concept, particularly when you put it against war, you know, as an anti-war thing. But if you fight for justice, if you fight for justice for Libyans, you give them some freedom from Gaddafi's murderous attacks. If you fight for justice for Syrians, you give them freedom from Bashar al-Assad's murderous attacks. But if you ask for peace in Syria, what does that mean? If you ask for peace in Israel, As I said, Israel already has peace because peace is a benefit to the powerful. It allows the powerful to continue to oppress the powerless. Justice gives the powerless some kind of voice in their own fate and in resisting, hopefully non-violently, the oppression under which they are. So I think you should rename the organization. I know it's a national organization. You can't do this by yourself, or even here in Washington. Call it Justice Action. Don't call it Peace Action. We are about 3 minutes past time. Yeah. Let's take that last question, and then I think we better wrap it up. Yes, sir. I agree. I think the people who are suppressing your dialogue and your impetus, what you're trying to accomplish, is not this conference. It's, I hate to say it, it's the Israel lobby. And I call it the Israel lobby, not the Jewish lobby. The Israel lobby is very, very important in policymaking. Who do you think it is that writes legislation having to do with Israel in Congress? Who is it who makes campaign contributions that prevents congressmen and senators from criticizing Israel? The Christian right is awful. I agree with you totally. But the Israel lobby has been around for longer than the Christian right. The Christian right is just terrible. Exactly. And they're suppressing this dialogue in here, too. Okay, I think we better quit.